right, welcome to Memory Safe. Today here we have Decipher's own editor-in-chief, Dennis Fisher. Dennis, thank you so much for coming onto the show. This is kind of like a Twilight episode here.
It's really weird, but I'm really happy to be on your podcast, Lindsay. Thank you so much. This is an
Yeah.
honor.
Well, I was thinking this was your concept. And I remember back in August, you came to me and said, hey, I have this great idea called Memory Safe, which is going to be a video series where we talk to different people across the security space and ask them the 10 same different questions. This is something that you thought of from the start. And we've had a lot of really cool guests since, we started doing this.
Yeah,
And who better than to interview you and yeah, on our own podcast.
I know I might regret this. This was sort of my idea. I think the other day we were talking about this, and I was like, well, I have a really good idea or maybe a really stupid idea. What if we do episodes with each other and see how that works out? Like,
Yeah.
oh boy, that could be fun or it could be terrible. Let's find out. So I'm
Yeah.
excited. I mean, should be fun. I love listening to the ones that you do. Like the most recent one you did with Sharon DeGrippo was just absolutely amazing. We were talking about that yesterday. It's so good. So
Yeah, yeah, she's great. Yeah, that's why I love this industry is like you get to talk to like everyone is so interesting
yeah,
and everyone has really cool stories and experiences and I do feel like the questions that we kind of developed here like bring those out and it's not all about like APTs and
oh god, I know.
RCE and
Yes,
things like that.
yeah. The idea was just to like get to know the people. Not so much like yeah, sure, what they do, but also who they are and why they do what they do. And I think it's been really fun to sort of dive into that stuff with everybody.
Yeah, yeah, I've loved that. So,
Yeah.
all right, let's start here with the first question. When did you get your first computer?
I was trying to think. I don't know the exact year. I think it was probably 1979 or 80, somewhere in that range. It was an Apple IIe. I could have looked up when that came out, but it was an Apple IIe, and we had it in our house, and it was in our living room, and it like sat on a little card table. And for like you're a youngster, so you don't you don't know what those things look like, but an Apple IIe like it just doesn't have a monitor, so we had like a little probably like 10 or 12-inch black and white TV that was the monitor. And, I don't remember what the memory was on the computer, but it was really slow. You couldn't really do much with it. I remember me and my sisters, basically all we did was play this one game called Lemonade Stand, which was like exactly what it sounds like. Little sort of stick figure drawings of like, you own a lemonade stand on the
Yeah.
sidewalk in front of your house, and like you try and sell lemonade to people that walk by. Like I don't even I don't know who came up with
Awesome.
this. It's so weird. I've talked to other people like my age that remember this, and they're like, "Was there even a point? Like, what could you win? Did you make money?"
Yeah.
I have no idea. I truly don't remember. I just remember playing it a lot. And my dad was an engineer. He worked for IBM, which is funny but IBM wasn't really making PCs at the time. It was right around the time when they were starting to sort of think about that.
Mhm.
So the first machine we had was an Apple IIe, and I really wish that we did hang on to it for a really long time. But at some point, I think my dad was just like, we got to get, or probably my mom, honestly, was like, let's get this thing the hell out of here. We have like three other computers in the house now. What do we need this, footstool for? But I do remember it like being pretty eye opening at the time because, you know, there weren't computers all over the place. Like our school didn't have computers really at the time. There was probably one in the main office or something like that. But and you couldn't go online 1980 or whatever. There was really not that much to do with it. There was a word processor and
Right.
stuff like that, but I do remember like being kind of fascinated by it,
Mhm.
which has translated 40 years later into us sitting here talking about computers.
Yeah, seriously. It is funny though, to your point, like I feel like a lot of people that I've talked to in the industry have like kept kind of their first computer or like different, components or whatnot. And I wish that there was more of that because like in some of these cases like these were our parents' computers or something and they ultimately get like thrown away or given away or whatever. And
Yep.
I don't know, I think that it's it's really a part of history to like go back and look at like, huh, I remember, doing this or that, or like that it used to look like this. So
Yeah, it's very much that. I mean, a lot of the conversations that I have with folks in the industry that are, my sort of generation, it's a lot of that of like we all got computers before the internet existed for, consumers, and so it was sort of sitting in your house by yourself or with your friends or your brothers and sisters trying to figure out what the hell to do with this thing and how they worked. And that's when a lot of people sort of learned programming and sort of dug into it. And I do remember, I don't know what year this was, probably 2000. Oh, it must have been 2002. I was in San Jose, and there's a computer history museum in San Jose, which
mhm.
is really cool. And I went in there one afternoon, and I remember like seeing the Apple IIe in there, and I was like, "Oh my god, I'm so old!" Like the first computer I had is in a museum now.
That's great.
Holy crap! Yeah, it was like it was super great, but I was also like, "Oh
Yeah,
god,"
yeah.
just like sort of dispiriting.
Yeah. If it makes you feel better, I feel like that's what, they're probably gonna have like the iPod or like some of the
Oh
other
yeah,
things in there, and it's just all a part of the history. So
it's true. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine
yeah,
now, but I remember at the time, just like your heart,
yeah,
you're just like, oh,
yeah.
you know,
What? Yeah,
yeah, I'm not that old. Come on.
yeah,
I don't even think I was 40 at the time, or not even 30. So I
yeah.
was just like, God, this is brutal. Yeah.
um, yeah. So, and then follow up to that is, but when did you first go online?
I was thinking about this yesterday. I think it was probably we got around right around the same time, probably 1987, 88. I was in high school,
Hmm.
and I remember my dad signed up for both CompuServe and this other service called Prodigy, which were both just like sort of dial up, not really bulletin board services, but just dial up online services. I remember Prodigy had like this weird thing where you could do shopping on there. So you would dial into the Prodigy service, almost like the AOL service later on.
Yeah.
You dial into their network and you sort of sit there and it gives you a menu, and like you could shop at like Sears. You could buy flights. Like I remember us booking flights through like United on this service. And
Hmm.
I can remember my dad being like, well, I think we have tickets. I guess we'll find out. You just kind of like, who
Yeah.
knows? The computer says we have them. But I remember the Prodigy service mostly. I can't remember much about CompuServe, but I can still remember my Prodigy email address from like 38 years ago or whatever the hell it is. And I
Hmm.
remember like sending emails to like my friends, sort of across town that had a Commodore 64 and was able to get online and that sort of thing. You could just call them
Yeah.
on the phone, but now let me send you an email, and sort of being like, this is really cool.
Yeah.
And then I didn't really do much with it until really college. Like when I went to college, my dad gave me his sort of like he upgraded to a new IBM PC and gave me his older one.
Hmm.
And I took that to school and had Prodigy on there. And every once in a while, I'd remember to like email my parents, like if I forgot to call them on Sunday or whatever. I'd just be like, still alive, all's well, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. But didn't really sort of get much online until after college. Honestly, like the mid '90s when AOL was a big deal and everybody was sort of online, and it was like everybody was on Instant Messenger, and you're just sort of like, and there were honestly like job boards and things like that, and you could connect with people. And you know some of my high school friends that had moved across the country, and you're like, oh, I can actually contact them and stuff like that. So that
Yeah.
was really it. But it was a very slow progression from like the mid to late 80s until like a decade later, and then like everything just really accelerated from there.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about that the other day, just like in the 90s, like people really being able to like be connected more and like,
Yeah.
have that accessibility like right on their lap or their computer at that point. Like just being able to, I feel like that changed how people communicated, but then also like use their computers. So it's interesting to see like how that did develop over time.
Yeah, and it really did go quickly. I feel like from, you know, the 96, 97, when, AOL was just like airdropping CDs onto everybody's lawn. you
Yeah.
know, for
Forgot
literally
about
for
that. Yeah.
shoving them in your
Yeah.
mailbox or whatever. I can clearly remember one of my college friends actually went to work for AOL right after college. And we would all, like, whenever we get together and have beers, we just yell at him. We were like, dude, can you guys just cut it out with the stupid discs? Like, enough. Like, yeah, I
Yeah.
got my 10 free hours. I don't need any more of this stuff. Just enough, you know?
Yeah.
But
That's it's really funny. Like I totally forgot about like the discs that you put in and then the yeah, the beep
it
sound.
was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Fun times. Yeah. Um okay, so question 3. What was your first exposure to hacker culture?
I think it must, I mean, in real life, it would have been much later, but I think in general, it was one of two things. One was the book called The Cuckoo's Egg by Cliff Stahl,
Yeah.
which other people on this podcast have mentioned. I've talked about it a million times. My dad had it, and I remember just sort of like being in his office one day at home and looking at his bookshelf and just being like, "Oh, what's this?" And he explained sort of the concept. He was like, you should probably read it." I was probably in high school at the time. Like, okay, yeah, I'll get to it at some point. And I remember like sitting down one summer and reading it. And I was like, holy shit, this is amazing. What an
Yeah.
absolutely great story. I'm sure everybody listening to this knows the story of the Cuckoo's Egg. It's an amazing uh, story and really well written. And I just got sort of fascinated by that. It was like very sort of cat and mouse and espionage, but also, you know, just this guy who was an astronomer, astrophysicist, like trying to figure out who got into their system at Berkeley and how they got there and what they were trying to do and sort of chasing them around the network.
Yeah.
And then I've probably read that book like more than any book ever, like including my own books, honestly, but which is weird. But
I feel like that says a lot because I know you read a lot too. So
I know. Yeah. And I've reread that book several times, like a couple of years ago, probably during the pandemic. I remember reading it again. And but then around the same time, War Games would have come out before that, I think. But I remember loving War Games. I remember seeing it at the theater. It's still one of my favorite movies. That was sort of, they're sort of along the same lines. Like the themes are a little similar, and I remember seeing that on the movie screen and being like, "This is really cool. I'd love this." Very cool, like Cold War type, story. Loved it.
yeah.
But like real life exposure to the hacker culture, I didn't really get until I started covering security in like 2001.
Hmm.
And that would have been probably meeting the guys from the Loft.
Hmm.
Chris Wysopal, Joe Grand, Mudge, Space Rogue, all those guys I met right around 2001 or maybe late 2000 in this really weird coincidence that those guys know, but I don't know if I've ever actually talked about this, but um, I just started covering security at eWeek.
Hmm.
And my wife was working at an ad agency at the time in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her ad agency was actually doing the ad work for At Stake. They were producing like the collateral, like the brochures
Hmm.
and like one pagers and marketing material that they were the giving out to potential clients.
Yeah.
And I remember going to visit the At Stake offices in Cambridge and seeing that stuff on like a table. I was going to like interview their CEO at the time, I think, and seeing
Hmm.
that stuff on the table, I was like, wait a second, my wife's like, she didn't know and I didn't know. Like,
Yeah.
I picked it up and was like, my wife did this. Like, this is really weird.
Yeah.
But
That's
that's
so
when
funny.
it's so weird. It's like I still have a copy of it. Like, there's one in a box behind me
Yeah.
that I still have a copy of that brochure. And I remember meeting those guys, and I didn't. This was right after At Stake had sort of formed and had acquired the Loft essentially,
Yeah.
and so I didn't know them before At Stake, but I got to know them really well after that.
Hmm.
Still, good friends with some of those guys, and that was my first real introduction to like, oh, these are the guys that sort of are like sort of built the hack excuse me, the hacker community in the 90s and are
Yeah.
now essentially building the security industry at that time. As
Hmm.
it turns out now, we didn't really know it at the time, but that was my first real exposure to it. And then I think that same year I went to Black Hat for the first time, and it was still really small.
Hmm.
Um, this is when it was still at Caesars, and I can remember going. I might have there might have been like two other reporters there. I remember going. It There was only one track. It was all in one room. I remember asking Jeff Moss, who ran Black Hat, started it and all that kind of stuff. I had to borrow an Ethernet cable from him and go and sit in their like network closet at Caesars to hook up my laptop to like file a
Yeah.
story, because the rooms at Caesars didn't even have internet access at that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Which, thinking back on it, was maybe one of the dumbest things I've ever done. Is like literally plugging my corporate laptop into Black Hat's network, like
Yeah.
at the show. I didn't even think about it, but it
Was there
happened.
a wall of shame back then?
That's a great question. There
Yeah.
probably was.
Yeah.
There probably was, and
Yeah.
I was probably on it and didn't even know it.
Yeah.
But that
That's
was yeah, that was my first real exposure, because you
yeah.
there was probably only a few hundred people there, and I don't know who they were. I did meet a bunch of people there, but at the time I was like, man, this is kind of a weird scene. Like, these folks are a little out there.
Yeah.
Now I absolutely love that scene, but it was just like, it was so 180 degrees from what I knew and like sort of what I was familiar with. So I was just kind of like wandering around, like, guy's got a mohawk.
Yeah.
That guy's got purple hair. Like, this is kind of cool. I like it.
Yeah. That's I wanted to ask like how your experience was, you're talking a little bit about how because that's a really interesting point in the security like timeline, like going from kind of that community-based setting to like now it's grown obviously more into like industry like full
Yeah.
on. How was that like being a journalist and all of that? And having that role, like was it do you feel like it was different back then at that time than it kind of has grown into now?
It was very different. And I think in a lot of ways it was a lot easier then, because there were so few of us that were really covering security. I could probably name them on one hand. And because there weren't that many tech pubs that really cared about security, that most of the tech publications were really focused on like products. It was like,
Mhm.
what new software, what new hardware is coming out. So the folks like me that were writing about security and privacy to some extent at that time were few and far between.
Mhm.
And it was really like, you could go and you could easily contact the people that had done all the stuff that you wanted to write about, had written the tools, were developing all the security products at that time. They were easy to find. They were all still around, you know actively involved in the community. And if you were curious and you were, sort of good at talking to people, you could easily develop relationships with those folks. It's so much harder now, I feel like, just
Mhm.
because of the scale of both the industry itself and like the security journalism world. I mean, there's
Yeah.
dozens, if not hundreds, of security journalists just in the US.
Yeah.
So we go to RSA in a couple of weeks, or we go to Black Hat this summer, the press room will have 200 people in it, at
Right.
any one time from all over the world. It used to be I'd walk in there and know the four people in there and be like, "Hey guys, how's it going?
Yeah.
You guys want to go get lunch or whatever?" Now
Yeah.
it's so big, and it was a lot easier back then to sort of get to know the people inside the vendors too, like
Mhm.
the people at MSRC, or the people at you know that was just starting Google, or security folks inside big vendors and things like that. You could find and talk to those folks. It's
Yeah.
it's so hard now. It's just, as it's so much more difficult.
Right. Yeah, because that's a good point too, is like a lot of these companies that like are well known now, like at that point were either like, a couple years old or like, even just being formed at that point and maybe had a different outlook on, cybersecurity or like their interactions with
Oh
the
yeah.
press. Yeah.
Yeah, they were all going to change the world, is the one funny thing. Like,
Yeah.
their one appliance was going to fix it all. Like, there were so many magic appliances. It's incredible to think back on that, but it was also very cool because a lot of the founders were, still running their companies, or their little open source project or whatever it happened to be, and you would see them 4 or 5 times a year at conferences. You'd see those folks all the time, which was great.
Yeah.
Now you know it's so much of a different landscape. Yeah, the security community and the security industry are two different things, and the community aspect of it, I feel like, is much less prevalent now.
Mhm.
Even if you go to something like B-Sides, that's where you'll
Yeah.
find it a little bit these days. But even that, I mean, it's sponsored and there's vendors and all that kind of stuff. So it's
Yeah.
just totally different.
That's like I wish that there still was more of that community, like a bit
Me
bigger. I think
too.
it's harder now, but like because like you said, it is such a bigger landscape now, but
Yep.
it's also I do feel like there's a little bit like that's needed a little bit in this industry, just being able to connect not just over Twitter, like, hot takes on LinkedIn or something. So
Yes. No, you're exactly right. And I think a lot of the folks, you know, my generation, even folks a little bit older than me, do sit around and sort of lament that a little bit, just because
mhm.
not so much like the get off my lawn. It's more like back in my day, this is how it was, and we all sort of knew each other, even if we'd never met in real life and that sort of thing. Whereas now, like I said, it's just like the sheer scale of it is so much harder to manage, and trying to find, you know, when we're at RSA in a couple weeks, it'll probably be impossible for me and you to even find each other in the
Yeah.
Moscone
Yeah.
without like a prearranged meeting point, because there's
Right.
going to be 45,000 people there.
Yeah.
It's just impossible. It's just, I mean, that's how it goes. That's how everything just gets bigger and louder. But yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely do miss that. There's no question about it.
Yeah. All right. So when did you think you might make this a career? And this kind of actually fits back, like, we're talking a little bit about those starter days at uni.
Yeah. I think if we're talking about this as in security journalism specifically, probably around that 2003, 4, 5 time frame, when things were really getting, before that, security just meant not much. It was like, what is Microsoft doing? Like, have they fixed anything in Windows yet? There was not a lot to write about. Like, we really struggled to find security stories, honestly, which is hilarious to think about now.
That's
But
great.
yeah, I know. But around the time that the trustworthy computing memo came out, which I believe was '02, I always get this wrong. I think it was '02. Then Microsoft started trying to, do this big security push. Then there were all these sort of email borne viruses, and there was a lot of DDoS attacks happening. Then people were starting to figure out, there's a bunch of little like annoying DDoS crews that were, taking down big government sites and all this kind of stuff. And there was some of that stuff going on that really made life a lot more interesting
Yeah.
for journalists.
Hmm.
And it became really sort of fascinating to follow that stuff. So I was like, you know what, this is a lot more interesting than writing about products themselves. Like, I want to write about the people and sort
Hmm.
of the psychology and like why people do this stuff, and how the defenders are trying to defeat them, and sort of the mindset and all that kind of stuff that we both love.
Right.
And that's sort of when all that stuff was really sort of taking off. So I don't know that there was ever any conscious decision. Most of the people we have on this podcast, you ask them that question, are like, I don't know, it just kind of happened. Just like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was good at this thing and then it became a job. You know,
Right.
I always wanted to write. It's the only thing I'm really good at. So I figured, why not write about something interesting? And this is super interesting. And it just sort of kind of evolved, over the years. I was like, wow, I've been doing this for 5 years. I've been doing this for 10 years. Oh my God, I've been doing this for 22 years or
Yeah.
whatever it is now. I keep having to up the number, but I still absolutely love it. It's still, the most interesting thing to write about in technology as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's a good point too about like getting boring to just write about the products, because that's kind of how I felt too. Like, I went to CES for a number of years and I was just like, this is just like so repetitive. I wanted to do like I it crossed my mind where I was like, what if I just went up with like a little mic and like asked every single vendor in like that big exhibit hall, like, what, how secure is this? Like, what's the security measures you guys are using? And then I was like, maybe I should go into security. So I feel like every security journalist has like had that moment if they've come from like the broader tech industry where
Yeah,
they're like, yeah.
you're exactly right. I only went to CES one time, and I can clearly remember I was there with my editor, and I remember walking in. I don't even know why I was there. I think somebody, one of our other reporters, like couldn't go or something.
Mhm.
I was like, yeah, sure, I'll go to. It was in Vegas. I don't know if it still is,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
it was in Vegas. I was like, okay, cool, I'll go to Vegas, whatever. I remember walking into the old Las Vegas Convention Center by
Hmm.
the Flamingo, right, or the Hilton, whatever it was.
Yeah.
Walking in, and this would have been in like 2005 or something. Walking in, looking at it, and being like, nope, and literally like you turned. It was like, I'm not going in there because it was just like screaming and people on segways and all that shit. And I was like, absolutely not. I'm
Yeah.
not doing this. Like, I'll find a way to get a story out of this, but I am not going into that place.
And it got more ridiculous like the probably like a decade later when I went, like, there were
Yeah.
like drones playing ping pong, like I
Oh,
don't know, like just yeah, people falling asleep on the floor, like it was just
oh,
insane. Yeah.
oh. That reminds me of like the old versions of Comdex. Like, I don't think Comdex exists anymore, but
No.
the couple times I went in the early 2000s, it was like that too. Just like
Yeah.
100,000 people in this place, like literally with bullhorns screaming at you.
Yeah.
And it was just my worst nightmare. Like,
Insane.
no, guys, let's go to the pool. Like, I'm not doing this. We're not,
Yeah.
no. Uh-uh.
It's interesting though that you say that too, because I feel like I was curious, if there was like one story in particular where you were like, after you wrote it, you were like, this is really what I want to do. But it seems like it just kind of more happened over time.
There's one I can think of, and this is kind of hilarious and antiquated to think about now too. I probably still have the magazine. One of the cover stories I wrote for eWeek was about organized crime groups getting into phishing,
Hmm.
which now is like the most obvious thing on earth. Well, yeah, of course. Like, who else is doing this? But at the time, like in the early 2000s, phishing was just literally the guy in a basement doing it, sending out, you know, the most basic crappy emails trying to get your credit card number or even you to PayPal them money. It was the dumbest thing, right? But then some of the first organized groups that got into it were just happened to be Brazilian groups for whatever reason. And I wrote this cover story that was about that. And I think the headline was like Phishing Inc. or something like that.
Hmm.
And it was, for a magazine story, it was like long back then because they were cutting pages. Like, magazines were dying literally in real time.
Yeah.
And I think, I probably got like 1,200 words or something that was like enormous. It was like, oh my God, how do I, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And I remember finishing that story and thinking, this is cool. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, it's bad that organized crime is involved in this. Let's, sure.
Yeah.
But it's also really interesting. So that was one of the ones where I kind of hit me of there's something here. There's a lot more going on than meets the eye.
Right. Yeah, that is cool. That's I wonder if it's still like if anyone can find that anywhere, like if it's
I bet they
online.
can't. I know that I have the physical copy of it because when I was like rearranging my office a couple months ago, I found it,
Hmm.
and my wife was like, "We got to throw this crap out." I was like,
Yeah.
"I know, but I'm keeping this one. Like, I
Yeah.
throw away a lot of stuff, and I'm going to keep this. It's this literally doesn't exist anywhere else anymore. This might be the only copy."
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Um, all right. So this is here, back to the questions here. But what was your alternate career idea?
I never really had one, honestly, and this is the funny thing. Like, when I went to college, my only idea was I wanted to be a journalist. And this is when newspapers were still like a viable sort of career path. You get hired at a local paper, sort of work your way up, go to a bigger paper, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's really all I wanted to do. I saw or I read All the President's Men in high school. like every other, you know, kid in the 80s, like journalist in the 80s was like, oh my God, this, they took down the president. Like, this is what I want to do. And
Yeah.
then you see like the movie with Robert Redford and you're like, that's me. And
Yeah.
then you discover, no, that's not you. It
Yeah.
is absolutely not you. You are going to be covering city council meetings
Yeah.
at 8 p.m. on Tuesdays,
Yeah.
and you're going to hate it. And that's what you're going to do. And if you're lucky, you might get to go cover high school volleyball like on a Saturday afternoon. And that's kind of what it was. And
Yeah.
I loved it. Like I was making, I think, like $17,000 a year, my
Hmm.
first newspaper job,
Yeah.
which is like, I mean, come on. It was, but I loved it. I was working in a newsroom with a bunch of other 23 and 24-year-olds. You know, the news editor was like a half an hour older than me. It was like, it was a bunch of kids just running this newspaper. We had the best time. We didn't, I don't know that we did all that much work, but we had a lot of fun. And then it just kind of moved on from there. But I didn't really have another idea. And I remember my dad always being like, well, what are you going to do if that doesn't work out? I was like, I don't know. It's going to work out. It'll be fine. Things just work out, right? He's like, not really. It's not usually how the world works. I was like, I don't know. We'll figure it out. My mom was like, sure, go right. Go do your thing.
Yeah.
And luckily, I never had to figure that out.
Hmm.
Because I truly, truly don't know what I would have done. Um, I think I probably, like when newspapers and all that kind of went to hell in the 90s, and I was sort of thinking about like maybe I need to figure something else out here, but a bunch of my college friends were, you know, working in tech and working in like video game testing and, you know, working at AOL and working at like consulting jobs and things like that, and they all hated them. And I was
Hmm.
like, that doesn't, none of that looks like fun to me. I don't want to do that, you know? And which is kind of a stupid way to approach your career. Like it doesn't, it needs to be fun, but I mean, we've been lucky enough that I think that's worked, but
Yeah.
I just, I never really had a plan B, which, you know, I guess in some ways is good because some of the most successful people are like, this is just what I want to do and I'm going to go do this thing.
Yeah.
It just sort of, yeah, just sort of worked out.
That's, yeah, I feel like every journalist has had that conversation with themselves in their 20s and been like,
Yeah.
this is fun. Like, do I, you know, what do I want? What am I doing like next? Do I want to keep down this path, or do I want to, you know, pivot, or do I want to use my writing as a hobby, or, you know, there's just so much there that goes into it, and it's your job. Like, it's what you're doing, you know, at least 8 hours a day. So it's
Yeah,
a big decision.
I know. And that's the thing for me. I don't know about you. I always ask people this question. You know, I think we ask it on this podcast. How do you describe to people what you do? You
Hmm.
know, if you meet somebody at a cocktail party or, you know, at the park with your kids or something, and they say, oh, what do you do?
Yeah.
And my, like, I always say I'm a writer. And it, well, actually, it depends who I'm talking to. If it's somebody I'm interested in talking to, I'll tell them I'm a writer. If I'm not interested in talking to them, I'll be like, oh, I work in tech. I'll be like, oh, cool.
Yeah.
Don't care. Yeah. And that's the end of it, right? You're like,
Yeah.
thanks. Nice meeting you.
Yeah.
But it, if you tell somebody you're a writer,
Hmm.
they're always going to be interested. They're going to, oh, what do you write about? What, what kind of stuff? Oh, do you write books? Are you a journalist? Do you do, what do you do? So it's always an interesting thing, but it's hard to explain to people. If you get deeper, you're like, well, oh, what do you guys write about? Well, computers and stuff. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, that might end the conversation too sometimes, you know, because they're
But
just like,
yeah, it's interesting because I do, that's very similar to like my conversations with people, but and it usually stops at computers. But like if you think about it, like it's not, it's like, you know, the psychology of like people, and like it's like, why might someone not do this or do that instead? There's like so much to it that it's so, it's computers, but it's like also like human mentality, and there's a lot to
yes,
it.
that's exactly right. And it, like I said, it all depends how much I want to talk to that person, how deep I'll get into it.
Yeah.
But, you know, even I bet when you first started writing about security, you would probably still have to explain to people what you meant.
Oh
But
yeah.
now you don't. Like if you just say I write about hackers, people are like, oh, I know, yeah,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
data breaches or, you know, whatever. There's a way that you can communicate it to them that they'll be like, got it. But
Yeah.
10 years ago, people were like, I don't know what you mean. Like, you know,
Yeah.
identity theft or what? No.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Now I've got people texting me being like, "What's this like about like Iranian hackers or like, targeting
All
our
the
water
time.
systems?" Like, yeah, just things
All the
like that.
time.
Yeah.
Yes. It's one of those things where you and I compare notes all the time, like after Thanksgiving or the
Yeah, yeah.
holidays or something. You're like, what did your in-laws ask you about? Like what,
Yeah.
you know? Yeah.
Yeah. So funny.
Yeah.
All right. So this is always a good one. Who was your hacker hero or who is your hacker hero?
I mean, for me, it's a group of people. I mean, I mentioned the Loft folks. Joe Grand, who's a good friend of mine, is an answer that one of our other guests gave. Daniel Cuthbert gave that. It's a great answer. I'm gonna Two of the people that I really consider hacker heroes are Window Snyder and Katie Masuris. And I know that Sherrod mentioned both of them too. I'm lucky enough to know both of them pretty well. And they're just they're two of the smartest people I know. They're so creative and they're so hardworking and focused. And they're also just kind, genuine people who have really contributed to this industry. I mean, I think a lot of people know Katie. She's very sort of like, she's very well known in the industry. Window is too to some extent, but Window is, or to a large extent, but Window is also much. She keeps herself a little more to herself and is a little more in the background. And she's building an amazing startup right now. But she's done so many things that people just don't even really know about or haven't talked about all that much. I mean, she was in large part responsible for Service Pack 2 for Windows XP back in the day, and a whole bunch of other security stuff in Microsoft and later at Mozilla and Fastly and a lot of places that, probably doesn't get enough notice. But yeah, Window and Katie to me are two of the just absolute, pillars of the security community that deserve all the recognition they've gotten and probably more.
Yeah, yeah. Those two always come up. And it's funny because whenever I ask this question, like, there's no just one answer either. Like, I feel like there's so many different people in the security space that, people are always listing like three or four because it just doesn't just show like, that there's a lot of really smart people in this industry, which there are. But like, I think the mentality of like wanting to have that connection and like teach people what they know and like say here's what I know about cybersecurity, like here's how I want to like impart that wisdom to others, is like pretty obvious whenever I talk to people about these types of this type of question.
Yeah. Another person I should probably mention is R Snake, Robert Hansen, who, God, I've probably known for the better part of 20 years, but has always been so helpful to me, both like in public and also like privately. When I was really just starting to sort of think I understood like security and how to write about it and some of the technical stuff, I could always email him or text him and say, "Hey, does this make sense? Is this a big deal? Am I thinking about this the right way?" And he'd always give me guidance and, sort of say, "Yep, you're on the right track here," or, "Here's the way that I would think about that from an attacker's perspective," or, "Hey, go talk to this person. He knows more than I do," or "She knows more than I do," which is almost never true. But yeah, he's been a huge help to me, and still is. He's one of the people I can rely on for advice, literally on anything, and not just technical stuff. So
Yeah, yeah, that's so valuable for a journalist too,
oh
to
yeah,
have that context and better understanding there.
especially in our field, if you don't have that, like you are in the woods. You're lost. Yeah.
Right, right. All right. This is I feel like I potentially know this one, but what is your favorite hacker movie and why?
All right. I mean, this is gonna be. I'm looking at a poster of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, like literally right above my screen here, which I absolutely. It's one of my two or three favorite movies of all time. And we did this on the Decipher movie podcast a few years ago. I actually want to redo it because it's just like I think it deserves more. But a lot of people don't think about that as a hacker movie, but it's just, it's all social engineering. Everything Ferris does is just convincing people to do what he wants them to do, right? Which is,
Mhm.
essentially what hacking is in a lot of ways. It's got so many great sort of lessons for how to relate to people, how to manipulate people, obviously. I mean, he's a
Yeah.
master at that. Um, how to get through the world, and sort of like, in a lot of ways, I relate to Ferris because he just sort of like, I was a little bit like him in high school. Like, I wasn't manipulative or like, but I was sort of like, I would just kind of wander through life and be like, yeah, things will work out. Like I said earlier, like things are, it'll be fine. Cameron will get in trouble. My sister will get in trouble. I'm
Yeah.
not really going to get in trouble. So yeah, that's one I always go back to. I also really love Sneakers. That's
Mhm.
much more of like a technical hacking movie. And I think it's, aside from war games, I think it's probably one of the best portrayals of what hacking actually is. There's a lot of social engineering in there too.
Mhm.
Um, and I know in your episode with Sherrod, she mentioned Heat, which is literally my favorite movie of all time. I've seen it. I can't even think of how many times I've seen it. I'll just watch scenes of it all the time. Like it's my like Gilmore Girls or Grey's
Yeah.
Anatomy or whatever. Like it's
Comfort movie. Yep.
yeah, which is really terrifying because like my wife will sit and watch Grey's Anatomy to like calm her down, and I'm just watching like a 14-minute shootout in the middle of LA. So like
Each their own. Yeah.
yeah, I mean that's just I got to be who I am.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's definitely some technology in that. Like part of the bank heist, they cut into the computer and install new boards and that kind of stuff. And there's a
Mhm.
lot actually in Heat 2, the book that came out a couple of years ago. So I mean, I'm wandering all over the place, but I would say Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Sneakers are like 1 and 1A for me. They're just I will stop and watch those movies anytime. And Ferris Bueller's like, my kids absolutely love that movie too, which of
Yeah.
course, you show a 14-year-old boy Ferris Bueller's Day Off and they're like, hell yeah. You
Yeah.
know, yeah, this is it. You're like, nope, settle down.
Yeah. That's funny you say that. Like I feel like Ferris Bueller's Day Off too, like captures like the like I don't know, just like mischievousness, like that kind of
Yep.
sense so well of all that. Like
Yeah.
I feel like that's also portrayed a little bit in like war games or some of the other ones, just
Mhm.
like it's not just like some like malicious person down in the basement with a hoodie or something. It's like
Right.
just playing around and like testing things out and yeah, I don't know. It's
No, I mean, that's true. And that, a lot of the hackers that we know, that's how they got into this. They got a computer and they phone freaking, they just wanted to figure out how these things worked. Like,
right.
how does this computer work? Nobody knows how computers work. Literally nobody. It's a
Yeah.
mystery, but you can dig in and you can figure out how a part of it works. You can figure out how the software works. You can figure out how phone networks work, especially 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
That stuff's a lot harder to do now, but yeah, it's that curiosity, which I still have and I hope I always have, that keeps me interested in this stuff. And I think it's what got a lot of those folks into it in the first place too. They just wanted to figure out how things work.
Yeah, which is awesome. Like
Yeah,
I love that.
absolutely.
Um I also think Matthew Broderick should come back and do another hacker movie type
Oh my
movie, like
God,
in the 2000 or 2020s or something. Like, just
please.
make a comeback.
Oh my God. Yes. Because I don't remember which podcast we talked about it on. It was probably it must have been Ferris Bueller because that came out after War Games. So there was, I think it was Zoe Lindsay on the podcast had this theory that Matthew Broderick's character from War Games became Ferris Bueller's kid. Like, it's the same person, you know,
Oh,
they're
interesting.
only a couple years or maybe 1 year apart.
Yeah.
The movies I think are like 2 or 3 years apart, but it's essentially the same kid, just sort of
Yeah.
like grew up, created Cameron as like his alter ego or vice versa, and then just got into some trouble or whatever. Yeah,
That's a
I would love to
genius
see.
theory.
I know Zoe's got a lot of great movie theories, but I would love that if they did like a War Games 2024. That would be terrifying, but
Yeah.
um,
Very different.
yes, yeah, I would love to see that. Yeah.
Um, okay, so you kind of answered this earlier, but how do you describe your job? Like, you kind of answered that before a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, it truly depends on the context. If it's somebody I think I'm going to be interested in having a conversation with, I'll say
Mhm.
I'm a writer, and then they'll usually ask me, oh, do you write books? Are you a journalist? Something like that. And I'm both. And then you just sort of go off and sort of describe what you do. And a lot of times people are really interested to hear about it. Sometimes their eyes will glaze over and be like, okay, I gotta, oh, my dog, gotta go. But um, yeah, and it's funny because some of my friends who are not in the tech world at all, people I've known since I was a kid or in college or whatever, who have completely different jobs, like think that I'm a hacker. And my kids sort of thought that I was a hacker when they were growing up because I knew all these people and I knew stuff like that. I'm like, no, 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 no. I know them, know
Yeah.
those people. That by no means, like I've literally no technical skills. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just, I, and other times I'll just be like, yeah, I work in the tech industry. Or
Mhm.
alternately, especially in Massachusetts, if you say you work for Cisco, sometimes people
Yes.
will think you work for the food distributor,
Yep.
which is really funny. And then they do not care. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, you work in a food warehouse? Like, yep. It's like, that's it. Just
Well,
conversation's over.
there's also, I mean, actually though, there is a Cisco brewery on
There
Nantucket.
sure is. Yes.
And so that's what I thought you were going to say because
Uh,
when I've said it, I've gotten the opposite reaction where people are like, "What? Like, oh, how is that?" Like,
that, which is very funny to me because actually a good friend of mine helped sort of develop the concept for Cisco Brewing when he was in college.
oh, cool.
So yeah. So whenever, like in this area specifically, my super local area, I will say Cisco the tech company, not
Yeah,
Cisco Brewing,
yeah,
which would be rad. You have to get on a boat to go there, but or Cisco the food distributor, which is like 10 miles down the road from me too, which is
yeah,
really
yeah.
funny. So it's like this weird hyper local problem,
You've got a lot of
but
Cisco in your life.
it's
Yeah.
really weird. I know. I know. Or if I say duo, they're like, oh, the language company?
Oh,
Nope. Nope. Not the owl. The no,
yeah.
not that one. But it's
Yeah, I will say, like, if I've worn a Duo hoodie or something, like, people like will be like, "Oh, like
yes.
multi-factor." Like, if I'm
Right.
in like the doctor's office or something, like everyone uses it, so it's just like they're like, "You're the one who is like making giving me the prompt on my phone," and I'm like,
Right.
"Yeah,
They'll either be super positive or
yeah,
extremely negative, which
yeah,
is really funny because last year when we were doing college tours with my son, I was wearing my Duo track jacket. I don't even remember what college it was. And some kid was like, I effing hate that. And I was like, I love this so much. I was like,
that's
you're welcome.
awesome."
You're welcome, kid.
That's great.
Yeah.
Oh man. Um, all right. So, uh, what was your biggest mistake and what was your proudest moment?
I was thinking about this last night when I knew we were going to do this podcast. And the biggest mistake thing is hard for me, but I would say it's not really even career related, but I wish that I had stuck with learning to program or code. Like I started learning that stuff when I was a kid, when I was in grade school. My dad was teaching me. Like it was sort of literally the opposite of like how you probably treat your kids where you're like, that's enough screen time, like put that away. He
Yeah.
was like, okay, Saturday afternoon, I'm going to teach you DOS. I'm going to teach you basic. I'm going to teach you how like file systems work and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I did learn it and I kind of liked it, but it was also sort of like a chore to some extent, where I was like, why am I going to like, computers aren't going anywhere. What do I
Yeah.
need to learn? Nobody's going to use these things. This is dumb. What do I need to know this
I
for?
know.
Right.
Little did you know. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's like every kid in trigonometry that's like, I'm never going to use this. Yeah. Actually, you probably aren't. But that was me when I was like 10 years old learning basic. It was like, what am I going to need this for? I don't. This makes no
Yeah.
sense. Like the people that build computers know how to do it. I don't. What do I need to know this for?
Right.
So I wish I'd stuck with that, or at least picked it up later at some point, just to have a better idea of, we look at a lot of technical reports and research stuff, and there's just big blocks of this. I'm like, skip, skip.
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
not going to do me any good. Like
Yeah.
I can sort of like I can read HTML okay, but like C++ and that kind of stuff, I can't figure out. That's what I rely on other people for.
Right.
So I sort of wish I had stuck that out a little bit. Um, I don't. I mean, it's not really a big. It's not like some huge mistake that I made, but
Yeah.
that's just kind of one of those things I wish I'd done. Um,
Yeah. I mean, that's a good one. Like, but I will say, like, to an extent, like it would be good to know that, but it's also like you don't want to have like too technical of a, like, it might make it a little easier just to say, like, to take a step back and say, like, here's like the reasons why this, how we can translate this from like something that's less technical to like a broader audience. Like,
yeah,
I'm sure it is good to have that though, but it's also like, you know, a lot of what we're writing about, we're trying to make it more understandable and like less like
right.
that.
I
So,
also, yeah, in some ways, I feel like if I knew a little more, I would be dangerous. Like if I get myself into trouble thinking that I knew what the hell was going on.
yeah.
Whereas now I'm just like, I definitely don't know. So let me go ask somebody, and they'll
Yeah.
go ask Talos, or I'll go ask Arsenic or
Yeah.
something, and they'll explain it to me. If
Yeah.
I thought I knew more, I could be, could get myself into some into some trouble with that.
It's easy to
Um,
get in the weeds. Like that's the
oh
one
God.
big thing that I struggle with is I'm like, oh, like, this, and this. And then I'm like, why does that need to be included in something that,
Yes,
not, yeah. So,
I know that's the thing that we specifically have to weigh all the time. It's like
yeah.
the balance between like technical and sort of more general.
Mhm.
How deep do we want to dig, and as opposed to just being like, here's the information you need, here's why it matters. If you want more, dig in here.
Right.
Which I think is what we sort of tend to, you know, default to, or sort of err on that side. Um,
Yeah.
you know, um, oh, so proudest moment, I think, yeah, I mean, the simplest answer for me is, I mean, well, career related, I think helping to start Threatpost and helping to start Decipher are two of the, I think, things I'm really proud of.
Yeah.
And non-career related, I would say when I was writing my first book, I had been I don't know, I was maybe halfway through it or something. I don't know, been messing around with it for a year or so. And, it's going along pretty well. And I hadn't really told anybody I was doing it. Like my wife knew and a couple of my friends knew, but that was about it.
Hmm.
Because it was one of those things where like, if you're gonna go run a marathon or something and then like you don't end up doing it, like, or you don't finish, you don't want people to know.
Yeah.
Just like, don't tell them.
Yeah.
So I hadn't, because I wasn't sure if I was going to finish it or whatever. So I hadn't really told anybody. But then around that time, my mom got diagnosed with dementia, and she was a big reader, and she was always the one, like, she was very like, you know, encouraging in my writing, and she, like, even the stupid crap you write in middle school and high school, she was like, oh, this is so good.
Yeah.
And as moms do. So I sort of, I was like, okay, I gotta buckle down, I gotta get this done
Yeah.
so that she can read it
Yeah.
and remember it, right? Like, know that I had done it. So I was able to get that done, and I went down to Virginia where my parents lived and gave her, like, surprised her on Mother's Day. She didn't know I was coming, and I gave her the book.
Oh.
And like, oh yeah, like
Yeah.
somewhere one of my sisters has a picture of it, like of my mom holding it, which is,
Wow.
that would have been 2012. So it was a while ago, but it
Yeah.
was really great. I mean, that was one of those things where you're like, hey, Ma, I did it. Like, just
Yeah.
sort of one of those things like, yeah, I'm not a complete screw up. Look, I did something that you can
Yeah.
like hold in your hand. And, she and my dad had no idea. I was like, my sisters knew at that point, but my parents didn't. So they were
Yeah.
really, and she loved it. She actually really liked it. And because it's not really the genre of book she probably would have read if it wasn't mine. But I think she genuinely liked it. She might have been lying. I don't know. But
I feel like there's nothing that you could do to make your parents more proud than like write a literal book and like get it
Yeah.
published. Like that's a really cool thing. So
It was. Yeah. It was one of those, moments in your life where you're just kind of like, yeah, that was good. Yeah. It was
yeah.
definitely a big thing for me. Yeah.
Because if you're like we both know this as writers, but like it's very like to publish something is like really special, but like to publish like an entire like put the thought and effort like that into it and then like put it out there, like that's like the one of the biggest like things you could do as a writer. Like
Yeah. I
yeah.
know. And it's also one of those things where I look back on it. I'm like, how the hell how did I get that done? I don't
Yeah.
like, because my kids were still pretty young at the time. And I think it's almost one of those things where like childbirth, where you sort of block it out of your head because
Yep.
otherwise nobody would ever do it again. Like every child would be an only child and
Yeah.
nobody would write more than one book
Yeah.
because you don't remember how painful the whole
Yeah.
process was. You know,
And that
like
that
I'm not
definitely seems to
equating.
work for you because you've published two books now, so you've
I
done it,
know.
gone and did it again.
I don't. Yes, and writing a third. So I
Yeah.
think, like, obviously I'm a slow learner, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not trying to equate your your experience with mine, Lindsay. But
No.
I am saying, like, I do not think that a lot of, even a bunch of our friends who have written like nonfiction books and things like that, which seems
Yeah.
infinitely more difficult to me. Like, I've talked to Andy Greenberg about this on the podcast. He writes these incredible, true crime type books, or investigative books, which is brutal. That's like years of research, and I'm just making shit up. Like, I can, if I just decide to, like, I can just change characters' names. I can do
Yeah.
whatever. You can't make a
Yeah.
mistake with those books. I'm just telling stories, like,
Yeah. But for both instances though, like I feel like if I try to organize anything, even just for an article, I've got like 50 tabs up, like I've got my notes, like everything gets scattered around, like I've got like mugs like that I'm like like on the side of my desk just like in disarray. And I for an entire book I can like I don't know like the organizational aspect of that like is so daunting to me. That must
this,
be one of the harder parts.
yeah, that might be why in both of my books I had characters like with two different names throughout the book. And like, early, friends of mine or editors were like, is this the same guy? You named him John and Brian. I'm like, this is
That's
what
great.
happens. Like, you know, when you write one chapter 6 months ago and then you come back and you
Yeah.
forgot what that dude's name is. So yeah, that
Um,
that has happened both times. So I'm trying not to go 3 for 3, but it'll
yeah.
probably happen. Yeah.
Oh man, that's great. All right. So we had okay. So what is your best piece of security advice?
I think for the general public, I mean, yes, we work for Duo. Yes, we work for Cisco. Turn on multi-factor authentication on
Yeah.
every account that you possibly can. I
Mhm.
mean, I think for our audience, that's general knowledge. That's table stakes. The folks we talk to are doing that. But I think the people that I talk to in my general life, I was at a restaurant a couple months ago now. I was just like chatting with the bartender, and again said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I was telling him, and he was like, "Oh, so what's like the one thing I can do that would, he was a youngish guy, he was probably 25 or something. What's the one thing I could do that would like actually make a difference?" And I
Mhm.
told him that, and he's like, "Oh, so like my banking app and all that kind of stuff." I was like, "Yes, banking, social media, all that kind of stuff. Turn that stuff on. You will have far fewer worries than you do right now. Like, it's just, it'll really defeat a lot of the stuff that you would have to worry about otherwise.
Yeah.
That's it's it's such a simple thing, but it's something that a lot of people don't do just because it's another point of friction. And they're like, I just want to get into my bank account, or I just want to post funny crap on Instagram. Like, I don't want to have to go through this hoop. But it's something that'll save you a lot of time and headaches. Not
Yeah.
to sound self-serving, but you know,
No, and I mean it literally takes like I mean
yeah,
it is like, an extra step or whatever, but like it takes less than a minute to set up. Like in a lot of cases you're just like turn on and then
yeah,
you put in your whatever like you wanted to add to it, but it is easy and like Yeah, I don't know. I agree. I feel like that's like the big thing that like from a consumer perspective, like
Yeah,
could help a lot, especially on like your banking app or like things like that. That should just have those kind of built in
I
and
know. And
sensitive. Yeah.
it's always scary when you run into some like financial app or something, like your retirement account that doesn't offer it. You're like, what?
Yeah.
What are we doing? Like, this is 2024, not 2004. Can we get this done?
Right. I
Yeah.
know.
But there's still plenty of them.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. And I know too, so one thing that we had mentioned was a bonus question. So
Oh, yeah.
that is a special bonus question. So do you prefer more of a fun bonus question or a like profound bonus question?
Oh, man. Well, you know me. So let's go with fun. Let's go with
Okay,
fun.
cool. So
Yeah.
I have three like rapid fire questions for you that are just like fun
Okay.
but easy. Okay.
Let's do it.
What's your favorite song?
Oh, probably Aurora by Foo Fighters, which is just, I mean, just all time favorite. Gives me chills every time I hear it.
Okay. And what's the favorite place you visited?
Oh, my favorite place I've ever visited. Ooh, I've been lucky to go a lot of places. I Two different answers. With my family, I would say Aruba. For you know other stuff, I would say Tenerife in the Canary Islands. Went there twice on trips. Had the absolute best time. Lots of very hilarious stories came out of those two trips with a bunch of our friends, and that just an absolutely beautiful place. Yeah.
That's awesome. And then finally, what's your favorite book?
I mean, I mentioned the cuckoo's egg, but more recently, honest to God, this is going to be such a like Dennis core answer, but Heat 2 is it's so damn good. And like, I'm incredibly biased because I don't know Meg Gardner, but I got to have her on the podcast when that book came out. She was
Yeah.
incredibly kind and generous, and like coming on a podcast she knew nothing about to talk about this book. The
Mhm.
book rules. It's incredible. It's so well done. There's a bunch of tech shit in there if people haven't read it, and I know they're making it into a movie. I think they're in pre-production or they're starting to film.
Mhm.
But I absolutely love that book. It's so good. I love it. Um, yeah, I mean, literally, I mean, you could have probably predicted that
Yeah,
answer
yeah. The
easily. You could have just done this podcast with yourself, Lindsay, and been
I
like,
know.
"Here's what Dennis would have said."
Yeah. For everyone and for anyone who hasn't listened to the that podcast you mentioned, that was a really good episode too, and it was really cool.
It was so
With
much fun. I was
yeah,
so nervous. I
yeah,
think you can probably
I
tell,
remember.
like,
Yeah,
listening
I
to my
remember you said
voice.
that before. Yeah, you were like, "Oh
Yes,
my gosh, I'm so excited."
I
Yeah,
was so nervous. It was so dumb, but I loved it. Yeah,
that's
it was
awesome.
great. Yeah,
Cool. That's all the questions. I know we usually
awesome.
wrap up like with one question you have for me. I mean, I feel like we're gonna get teed up for whenever you have me on this, but
You are. I'm gonna save that because we're
okay,
gonna
cool.
we're gonna do this on the other way. So
Yeah. Give
I'm gonna
it
save that. Yeah,
yes. Okay,
I think
cool.
I've got a couple good ones. We'll see.
I'm
Yeah,
scared.
it'll be good. It'll be good.
Awesome. All right. Well, Dennis, thank you so much for coming on to Memory Safe.
Thanks so much for having me, Lindsay. Good to see you.
Okay, thanks.